Now it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce the moderator for the second session, who in turn will introduce the excellent speakers of this second session. I'm referring, of course, to Dr. Neil King, who is the President Emeritus of IOP just this past presidency, and currently occupies the position of Chair of the Board of Directors of the IAUP. He has been president before that of at least two universities that I know of, and was very, very active as president during the presidency term before the current one. So he will lead the work today, and without further ado, I will leave the floor to Neil, please.
Thank you, Alvaro. So Carmen and her panelists did such a good job demonstrating the protocol. It's the same. I have the same, actually, elegant reminder from Jason. So I'll just jump right in. We have a topic which is unfortunately broadly and highly topical today in many parts of the world, and I look forward to what our panelists will be talking about, because I'm sure that it will immensely further enrich the discourse of the yesterday and today, which I think have been really admirable. So I look forward to these contributions. As Carmen did, I'm going to do a brief introduction of each of the panelists, and they are actually seated in the order in which they will speak. And then they will come up and give their presentations. And we'll look to Jason to see if there's time for comments at the end of those presentations. Dr. Elizabeth Davis Russell is the president of WVS Tubman College of Technology in Harper, Liberia. Sorry? Tubman University. I'm sorry, Jason. These are your notes. From Tubman University, of Technology in Harper, Liberia. Prior to this position, she served as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the State University of New York College at Cortland. New York, she has State University of New York College at Cortland. She has also served as Dean for Academic and Professional Affairs at the California School of Professional Psychology, Professor and Director of the Cross-Cultural Psychology Program at the same institution, and Founder and Director of the Center for Intercultural Clinical Psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And I'm proud to say that I've known Elizabeth for 25 years in these multiple contexts, and it's been a delight the entire time. Mr. Brendan O'Malley, who we met 20 minutes ago, is the chairman and managing editor of the University World News, which is one of our partner organizations. He is also a journalist, author, photographer, and television documentary maker who has written about education development and international politics for 25 years. He was international editor of the Times Educational Supplement from 1998 to 2006. As a consultant for UNESCO in 2007, he produced the first global study on violent political and military attacks against students, teachers, and academics worldwide. So welcome, Brendan. And well known, I think, to all of us, Mr. Rama Damodaran is chief of the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative, which aligns institutions of higher education and research with the objectives of the United Nations and the states and peoples who constitute it. He is also the secretary of the United Nations Committee on Information. He was a member of the Indian Foreign Service and was promoted to the rank of ambassador. Mr. Damodaran served as executive assistant to the Prime Minister of India and served in diplomatic missions in Moscow and to the United Nations. So Dr. Elizabeth Davis Russell will start us off.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I won't use up my 15 minutes telling jokes, but I'll just move ahead. Yesterday morning, Dr. Emmett Dennis, in his presentation, alluded to the civil wars in Liberia and spoke briefly about the devastation of the country. What he did not focus on was the devastation, the disproportionate devastation to higher education. I was fortunate to be a member of the American Association for State Colleges and Universities team that was asked to go to Liberia in 2007 to assess the state of higher education. And what we saw was just heartrending for me, because I was born and raised in Liberia. So to see the university that was the flagship not only for Liberia, but for Africa, where many scholars came from around Africa to study in the state that we saw it, led me on this quest to talk about conflicts and the impact on higher education. And so I'm going to continue in that vein. Last year at the last triennium, we held a panel that focused on the changing nature of war and looked at some of the consequences of war on higher ed. I wanted to take a look today. But if you think that Liberia is unique, it is not, because conflict is a global challenge. If we look across the world, we see many places where there is indeed war. In Asia, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in parts of South America. And so in 15 minutes, I cannot cover all of those. And so what I will do instead is to focus on some of the hot spots in Africa. There are 27 out of the 54 nations currently where there is some kind of conflict, either internally or externally. Some of the hot spots, and I would put Burundi there now because it wasn't there when I was doing the presentation, but Central African Republic, as some of you may know that from 2012 to the present, there's been conflict there. In 2012 of December, rebels seized several major cities and towns, and Chad then entered into the fray in support of the government. It sent in 2,000 troops. France then came in to protect French citizens, so then we saw another player involved in this. If we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, we see an even longer period of time from 1998 to present. And sometimes what we find are not one civil war, but many different civil wars, and with many different players. Some of the players are national, some are regional, some are international. In Egypt, we now have some problems, several uprisings, the removal of 2 presidents, and still conflict hasn't been resolved. We look at Libya, we see with the overthrow of Gaddafi, various groups are now become involved in fighting. In Mali, we've seen periods of instability with several uprisings. In Nigeria, which is one of Africa's, particularly West Africa, most populous region, we see Boko Haram, which is really at war with the Nigerian government and with others who do not subscribe to their beliefs and practices of the Islamic faith. In Somalia, we've seen a long history of conflict in Somalia. In 1969, coup that was followed by the collapse of the regime with disintegration into several factions. And now one of the most potent ones we have currently is Al-Shabaab, that is still warring not only with the government, but in all of this we've seen innocent people, civilians, particularly women and children, killed in the process. South Sudan. This is another area where there's been a long period. When the British left, we found continuing conflict. And one of the promises made was that Sudan would eventually give autonomy or independence to South Sudan. they reneged on that, and so the conflict intensified. And what the fighting continued, war broke out, and what we find then in terms of human lives, the devastation there, this then led to the granting of autonomy for South Sudan for about 6 years. That was followed by a referendum then that granted South Sudan independence, and many of us rejoiced when it became an independent country and the newest one, and lo and behold, it joined the fray with everybody else, and so we've seen civil war there. Sudan, of course, the two longest prolonged wars go back to the 50s, that ended in the 70s, and then another one began in the 80s, and so forth. So, but as I said, this is not a situation that is unique to Africa. I choose to focus on Africa because that's my current context. But we can do the same for Asia and Latin America and see conflict around the world. What I show you now is a selected number of these countries and their GDPs. So if you look at that, we really are not talking about rich countries. We're talking about countries that have meager to little resources. And my argument is if they're using these meager resources to fight prolonged wars, then what happens to education? What are the resources that are being contributed to education generally, but in particular to higher education? And as you will see, the case is self-evident that the percentage of their GDP or the percentage of their spending to education tells us that education is not a priority. What we have now is government expenditure in education. And this is, which country are we dealing with at the top? I can't see. Central African Republic, thank you. If you look at the government expenditure in education for those years, and some data are missing because the data were not available, you see very little change in how much has been expended on education. And as the president from the University of Rwanda said, oftentimes when there is conflict and there are decreases in expenditure, what's the area that's cut? Usually education is cut. So you see how, then you look at the government expenditure per student. And again, the picture is not one that is rosy for present. And if this trend continues, not rosy for the future. So it is my hope that as we talk about these issues, not only talk, but begin to do something about that, that we can influence the trend for better. Let's go. And the picture continues. You see, this is just called for this area of the country. Congo. And I'm told I have 5 minutes left. All right. Let's go. Just the rest of the slides will show you, in essence, the case I'm trying to make, that the percentage of expenditure to education is extremely low, and to tertiary education, even that much lower. So in my 5 minutes then, let's fast forward to what is it that we can do. What kind of legacy are we leaving our students? One of the points I'd like to make is that conflict as a global challenge also contributes to some of the other challenges that we have today and that may move into the future. Challenges such as poverty, disease, economic decline, and lack of governance. But do we then leave our students with a world of continued conflict? Or do we leave them with a world of reduced conflict where conflicts do not necessarily result in war? As a psychologist, I know that as people live together, particularly as diversity increases, conflict is inevitable. But what is not inevitable is war. That is, that we can find ways to resolve the conflicts so that they do not result in war. 3 minutes, thank you. What IAUP's slogan is, the voice of higher education. And I would ask, is it not time for IAUP to use that voice? Because what good is a voice if you don't use it? To use its voice to influence the course of events, to clearly articulate a future where there is less violence, where there is more peace, where there is more peaceful coexistence, and one in which education is a national and international priority and a right for every person. So the last slide I have asks, what can we do? Given our context in Africa, certainly advocating for more money for education, but one of the points that I stress is, in addition, and this is what we can do as universities to make conflict resolution a part of basic education, to develop peace studies in our institutions. Yes, to advocate for more money, to make higher education a national priority, but to develop entrepreneurial centers to augment revenues of higher education institutions. And at my institution, we said to students during the orientation, you're coming in not just to be educated to get a job, but to create opportunities to hire people. And so every student, regardless of major, takes courses in entrepreneurial studies. And I have 1 minute. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Mr. Brendan O'Malley.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. It's an honor and a pleasure. I wanted to talk about this particular subject because University World News, sorry, I must also apologize that I have a debilitating cough, so bear with me. University World News is very pleased to be a media partner of IAUP, and one issue that we report on at an alarmingly frequent rate is attacks on and destruction of education. It's an issue which, with another hat on as a researcher for UNESCO and other UN agencies, I have been steeped in for the past 8 years, having been involved in leading or writing 3 global studies on this question. And what we've found is that, alarmingly, that the rate of attack is high and appears to be increasing, though it's hard to prove that, and there's a scarcity of response. So my vision for higher education in 2065 would include an international framework in which monitoring of and protection against attacks on education were in place, and alternative provision for higher education in conflict-affected areas was developed and supported, perhaps to the point where it also became part of the humanitarian response. And I take your point about the length of wars. I mean, I think there's a UNESCO data that says that the average war in a poor country lasts for 12 years. That's an awful long time to have an impact on higher education and education in general. And yet, echoing what you were saying about government spending in terms of international aid and the humanitarian response, education really is left behind as the orphan in aid, and the proportion of money going on education is absolutely tiny. So advocating for a greater proportion would be a task worth taking up. So what do I mean by attacks on education? On the 3rd of April this year, a handful of armed militants stormed Garissa University College in northeast Kenya and killed 147 people, most of them students. The militants, who were from the Somali armed group Al-Shabaab, singled out Christians by asking students to recite the Quran, and those who could not were shot. The attack was similar, alarmingly similar in scale, to an attack in Pakistan in December at a school when 7 militants from a Pakistani Taliban group entered the army public school in Peshawar, headed for the school hall, and sprayed the gathered children with bullets for 10 minutes. 132 students and 9 teachers were killed. Attacks on schools and universities are becoming so common now that only those with record numbers, like the 2 incidents I've just talked to you about, record numbers of victims, get much of a showing in the international media. But these incidents are merely 2 out of thousands of attacks on schools and universities, or incidents of military use of such facilities in the past 10 years. Education Under Attack 2014, a study published by the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, found that in the period of 2009 to 2012, there were 13 countries in which there were more than 500 attacks on schools, universities, staff and students in each country. In the worst cases, there were nearly half of those countries, there were more than 1,000 incidents. So some of the worst affected countries were Afghanistan, Colombia, Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. The report documented attacks on higher education in 28 countries. For example, in Mexico, a group opposing nanotechnology research reportedly bombed 6 campuses and research laboratories and threatened 6 others just in 2011. And in Syria, 2 explosions at Aleppo universities killed at least 82 and wounded dozens more on the first day of midterm examinations in January 2013. In some cases, higher education facilities are taken over by armed forces and armed groups for military purposes. Buildings may be damaged or destroyed in the course of fighting, sometimes intentionally. One of the most seriously affected countries, as has been mentioned, is Nigeria in recent years. For instance, in March 2013, Boko Haram entered the campus of Adamawa State Polytechnic, lined up students and killed roughly 100 of them. A year later, in May 2014, the same group invaded the campus of a different university, Adamawa State University in Mubi, and indiscriminately killed around 70 students and staff. So violent attacks on higher education frequently also take place in non-conflict situations, and more often in those cases involve arbitrary arrest, detention, or persecution of particular students and teachers. Why are higher education institutions, students and staff attacked? Some facilities are attacked because they are strategically located buildings and are useful for the war effort. Many attacks on higher education are linked to government attempts to prevent the growth of opposition movements, to restrict political protest, quell education trade union activity, or curtail the freedom of lecturers and researchers to explore or discuss sensitive subjects. Some involve sectarian bias and targeting of ethnic groups. Others involve attacks by extremists who see universities as nurturing an alien culture. In dozens of countries, university students and staff are personally targeted and with threats of violence or murder. In Iraq alone, more than 550 professors, scientists, and administrators were killed in the 10 years after 2003. What impact do these attacks have? In short form, the answer is higher education facilities are targeted and destroyed, academic freedom is restricted, provision is aborted, often indefinitely. But on a human level, the minds of individuals are affected too. I would just share with you a personal story of mine. The first time I got involved in reporting on attacks on education, I visited a school in Kosovo in 1999 before the NATO bombings and the mass exodus from the country. I visited a little hamlet where all the houses had been torched by Serbs. These were houses of Kosovo Albanians, and the families were living in a blackened room. And the one thing that kept them going was that their school was still operating, even though the teachers weren't being paid. So I went to take a look at the school, and it was a big building on a hill overlooking a plain, clearly an easy target. And sure enough, when I got closer to it, it had shell holes in the wall. So I went in and talked to the head teacher to find out what had happened. And as I sat there talking to him, there was a scream and a loud thud, and the whole building shook. And it felt like a rocket had landed just outside the door. But actually it hit the other side of the hill, but with such force that the whole school shook. And from that point on, I began to understand a little more of the mindset of the students at that school. As I walked through the school, every time I heard a door bang, I wondered if it was gunfire. I wondered if it was another shell or gunfire. Every time you heard a noise, you jumped. I got to the end of the school, and there was a classroom there with children sitting frozen, with snow visible through the shell holes in the wall. But the real story was not the bullet holes or the pock marks on the wall, but the furrowed brows on their faces, the stern looks, that stare you get of people who are numbed by war. Some of them may have been seriously traumatized, but all of them, they did not look like children who were in a joyful learning environment. This was something that had been hanging over them for a long time. They'd been hiding in the woods for 7 months before they came back to this school, and here they were, their childhood was taken away from them. And it was seriously difficult to understand how they could be learning in that state of mind. So I think we need to bear this in mind when we look at the impact. It's a human impact. It's not just about broken buildings. And this experience helped me realize later when I researched the impact on universities in Iraq and how profoundly students can be affected, demotivated, distracted, fearful, in some cases psychologically traumatized. Security threats and fear can mean chronic disruption of attendance or permanent dropout of students or staff. Now, of course, higher education attacks may not only endanger lives, but also prove devastating for research and teaching, triggering fear, flight, and self-censorship among whole academic communities. Wider and longer-term consequences for society include restricting development, hindering the emergence and strengthening of political plurality, accountable government, and open democracy. In short, the reason why it matters to protect education is that education is a key to rebuilding after conflict, a key to enabling political development, a key to providing young people with an alternative to hopelessness and violence. What will the picture of attacks be in 2065? We can't possibly know whether the level of attacks will be higher. In recent years, the number of reported attacks has grown considerably, but we don't know if that is simply because more are being reported. It's easier to report them because of the growth of the internet. Could a factor be the different changing nature of war, that there are many more intrastate wars now since the end of the Cold War? Could another factor be the rise of militant movements with extreme ideology or anti-liberal views who see Western or modern education as an imposition of an alien culture? In the case of attacks on higher education, most incidents are actually carried out by the forces of the state. And that will only change if the global footprint of democracy and plural politics is increased. So what can be done about this problem? One thing is for certain, and that is that by 2065, if we are to see an improvement in the protection of education, we need to broaden and strengthen the variety of responses offered. One way is to hold perpetrators to account, but internationally we've been actually, hardly any perpetrators have been held to account. It's very rare for that actually to happen. Another way is to try to persuade governments and armed forces and even armed groups to do more to change the way they operate on the battlefield by avoiding the use of schools and universities for military purposes. This means not using them as bases, barracks, firing positions, or detention centres, all of which can make them a target of attack by opposing forces. An important international event is actually taking place this week, coming week, in Norway, in Oslo, hosted by Norwegian Civil Society and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and supported by the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, which may reduce that risk. A number of governments, and we're hoping it will be lots of them, will sign a Safe Schools Declaration, which also covers universities, endorsing guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict and promoting efforts to protect education from attack. Some extremely important work is being done by the scholar rescue organisations in providing grants and placements for endangered academics to continue to work, but outside of the country in which they are threatened. Some of the scholar rescue organisations are recognising too that we need a focus in which scholars are given places to work close to their home country so that it is easier for them to return home when the conditions are safe to help rebuild their country, and easier for them to contribute to serving the students in the diaspora, the exodus across the nearest borders caused by the threats or war. A key area where there is a weakness, though, is in alternative provision for student populations, where universities are not functioning or attending them is too dangerous because of security threats. In the age of the internet, mobile phone technology, MOOCs, free one-to-one discussion via Skype, and international partnerships in higher education, it should not be impossible for universities to help provide solutions to this problem, to make higher education resilient in times of emergency. What is lacking at the moment is a system of monitoring attacks, more widespread research into the nature, scale, and motives for attack, and collaboration on devising and implementing means of prevention and alternative provision for higher education in particular. It would be a fine objective for IAUP to establish a network of universities interested in working together to provide research, propose solutions, and collaborate on implementing them. And I urge you all to consider that.
Thanks very much, Brendan. Our third distinguished panelist, Mr. Rama Damodaran.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil. When Neil King took over as chairman of the board, I wanted to send him a congratulatory email. I had spent the previous day writing to a number of universities in Central Asia who were meeting in Kazakhstan. And for some reason, my computer had memorized the word rector. And so my email to him went, "Congratulations on your appointment as chairman of the board of dire rectors," which I was able to correct in time. Because with all respect, Toyoshi, Ichiro, Alvaro, none of you are dire. Jason, I'll rest my case. But be that as it may. Last evening, Ichiro, Tatsuro, and I decided to take a recce to find out where exactly this college was and how long it would take to get here. And of course, with Tatsuro's GPS, we lost our way and stopped a lady and asked her, "Where is Trinity?" And she looked at us, looked at Ichiro, looked at Tatsuro, and then looked at me and said, "You certainly don't look like the Holy Ghost." But being here, I think, gives a sense of perspective, because when Jason and I discussed the theme of my remarks, and we thought very loftily of UN 70 and IUP 50, and we thought of what a breadth of time this encompassed, and then you realize you're in these surroundings which are 500 years old and were actually built for secluded religious orders, then you begin to see how much more recent and yet how much more dramatic the sense of history we have, both as an organization like the United Nations and an organization like IUP. And if I like to think about what links our two organizations together, it clearly is the one word that is common in both their titles, the word nation. The United Nations attempts, as its name suggests, to bring nations together, united not necessarily in political sense, but in terms of a commitment to a course of life that they wish to see. The IAUP brings nations together in the sense of the international, of nations relating to each other. And you go back to the very beginnings of this organization and to the very first vision articulated by Dr. Yong-Sik Cho, where he spoke about understanding amongst nations which allows each of them to respect the other's indigenous cultures. In that first charter, Dr. Cho also, in the very first article, spoke about a new world order which comes into being through the light and the power of reason. Reason, the very first article in your premise. Openness, the idea of understanding, the very second article. And what I would like to suggest within the confines of this topic of how we are in a situation of war and peace is that as long as we have reason, as long as we have openness, both of which can be fostered and furthered by education, then we can move forward. But the moment we allow us to shrink back into ourselves, the moment we try and create regimes of xenophobia, if you will, and I'd like to expand on that theme a little, then we become powerless to prevent war. We become powerless, and Elizabeth differentiated between war and conflict, but to my mind, perhaps conflict is as much as important to defer or to avoid as war. The more powerless you are to do that. Bertrand Russell, who was at IUP at its very inception, once defined a nation as a sense of psychological unity among a living people. So it was the people who animated a nation. So you could, in a sense, be a nation even within the confines of a larger political entity. And you think back again to the 2 years that we are talking about, 1945 in the case of the United Nations, 1965 in the case of IUP. 1945 is not difficult to sketch because it was a completely fragmented world. Fragmented not only because of the results of the Second World War, but fragmented also by the very nature of the original membership of the United Nations. 51 member states. Today we have 193, which really means that there were 142 nations who are alive and well today who simply did not enjoy the attributes of nationhood in 1945. Look at the founding members of IUP in 1965 and the nations that they represented. You had Peter San Martino from the United States. The United States in 1964, when the idea of IUP was really beginning to germinate, and 1965 when it came to fruition, was rocked by violence of, in a sense, nation upon nation. The civil rights movement had started, and it was here in Oxford in 1964 that Malcolm X spoke and used a very telling phrase. He quoted Shakespeare's Hamlet about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and taking arms against them, and said, what we need is intelligently directed extremism. Mark those words. You have extremism, which all of us now reject and deny and want to confront. But then you qualify it by intelligence, something that education is supposed to impart or encourage. A year later, in 1965, Malcolm X was shot dead. But the civil rights movement, the struggle of the African American population in the United States was at its zenith in the point of time, something which Toyoshi was to study many years later in Berkeley. That particular moment in United States history was the war which animated IUP. You go to another nation which today has been a symbol of so much suffering and conflict, and yes, even war, Elizabeth's homeland. In 1965, Liberia was a proud, vigorous nation. And there was a Guyanese scholar who went to Liberia at that time and wrote saying, I came here in search of an indigenous script, the Vai script. No one seemed to know about it. And you have all these Western archaeologists talking about Egyptian hieroglyphics and about the ancient carvings in Mohenjo-Daro in my part of the world. No one knows this history of Liberia. That proud history reasserted itself in the Liberian presence in IUP. You look at Puerto Rico. That was the year when, under the intellectual leadership of people like Jaime Benitez, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico decided to set up a Puerto Rico Human Rights Commission. Again, the power of education as a means of political and social transformation. Go to the Republic of Korea and Yong Sik Choi. That was the year when, deciding to put aside the history of a bitter past, Korea and Japan decided to establish diplomatic relations and conducted a treaty between them. And then go to the Philippines, which was coming to the end of a rather inglorious period of national leadership, and suddenly looked to a man who promised to bring the country education, Fernando Marcos. He may have had his faults much later, but he did succeed in the course of his first 10 years in office of transforming the education landscape of Philippines and creating more schools and colleges than any other time in that country's history. And that was also, in a sense, the time when it was a world of fear, not only of war and conflict, but of personal insecurities. It was a time when the first American astronaut, Edward White from San Antonio, which Carmen and Navarro have made their home, walked in space. And you will remember, those of you who look back at the time, how he had to be forced back into his aircraft. He just wanted to remain walking there. He did not want to come back. It's absolutely true. And you can sense the reason why. So if you look at that sense, it was this mission on the United Nations side and of the IUP side of bringing reason and openness to bear and to allow it to constructively change the world. Another great figure who was, as we finally discovered in the United Kingdom at the time and at the opening of IUP, Adlai Stevenson, who was also a member of the governing board of the International Institute of Education, which Alan Goodman now so ably heads, once described education as the universal city of the mind, that you build brick by brick, insight by insight, discovery by discovery. And if you take that idea, that metaphor of the city of the mind, and you extend it to being a city which has a sense of identity and a sense of humaneness, then you begin to realize that that city must ultimately be governed by reason and by openness. And let me extend that metaphor of the city still further as a metaphor of what we are now in danger of in terms of war and peace. We've talked about 2065 looking 100 years later. Go 100 years before IUP was created. Go to 1865 and the City of London. It was finally getting its sewage system into place. For the first 50 years of the 19th century, people in England believed that they kept on throwing their human waste into the Thames and it would disappear. And people were concerned about the smells that were coming, but what was more important was people made no correlation between the cholera that was affecting large parts of the population and the fact that the sewage was going into the river. There was a man called James Snow, I believe, who studied a place in Soho on Broad Street and found, with the exception of 70 individuals, every person had been afflicted with cholera. These 70 individuals happened to be working in a brewery and drank only beer, which is why they were all exempt. No, this is fact. It's absolute fact. But then finally, Parliament decided to act when the great stink of 1858 assailed them and decided to build at £3 million a sewage system, which of course they then complicated by trying to combine it with an underground railway system, delaying the project further. But that is a metaphor for what we are now doing on climate change. We are not taking steps which we should be taking now, and we continue to throw our own waste, our human waste, whether it's fossil fuel or our own man-made waste, and then wait for the great stink of 1858 to come and hit us when we will choose to invest money. And I and the United Nations are immensely grateful to all of you for what you are doing in areas like that. Dr. Rahman, before coming here from Bangladesh, opened a conference on climate change and the fact of how societies and nations must be resilient in that regard. So this, to my mind, is really the way we must work towards war and peace, going beyond the conventional and very compelling ideas of war and peace to the idea of letting reason and openness come in. Again, how do we do this? Is it purely through international exchange? Mr. O'Malley had an article in the University World News a couple of days ago about a study by, I believe, the European Association of International Studies, about how people-to-people contact is necessary. On the other hand, the IIE in 1954 conducted a study by a San Francisco professor called Hilda Taba, which came to an astonishing conclusion, saying that foreign travel does not lead to international understanding. You have to go beyond that. You have to have contact. You have to have communication. You have to have openness. That is what creates understanding. It's not merely the physical aspect of going to a new location. And we are doing this. Don Betts and his team at the University of Central Oklahoma are now in Uganda, bringing back ideas and experiences home. So if we are able to, Gerald, where are you? I can't see the puff of cigarette smoke. Oh, sorry, here we are, sorry. Sorry, there you are, sorry. Again, the international character and the cross-cultural communications workshops at the University of Applied Sciences in Upper Austria. So this is why I say, if you are not able to bring that reason and openness to your students and ourselves, then you will fail. And what is more important is that you will not equip yourself to fulfill the last unfinished goal set for this organization, the last unfinished challenge set for us by Michael Adams, the creation of academic diplomacy, where each one of you will go, talk to your peers, and in that process, further the cause of war and peace. I promised Tatsuro an acronym, so I'm going to give it to him one day late, which is, without reason and openness, only xenophobia overtakes nations. So that's Roxton for you. But thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity of being here.